I do fear for this next election cycle, because who knows what that might bring. If a president that's willing to try to instill and encourage, to whip up a civil war amongst his followers using lies and deceit and snake oil.
Here's the thing. The possibility of another American civil war used to be a fringe talking point among online right-wing extremists, like the Oath Keepers he once represented. But the New York Times reports a huge jump in that kind of talk following the completely illegal search of the former president's Florida club. Quote, posts on Twitter that mentioned civil war had soared nearly 3,000% in just a few hours, as Trump supporters blasted the action as a provocation. Similar spikes followed, including on Facebook, Reddit, Telegram, Parler, Gab, and Truth Social, Trump's social media platform. Let's bring in Clint Watts, a West Point graduate, Army veteran, former FBI special agent, and a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Clint, can you just put some context around this for us? Exactly what are they saying when they're calling for a civil war?
Yeah, I think, Alicia, there's some categories that you can put this into. There's a spectrum, much like we saw on January 6th. There's a spectrum of groups and individuals that will show up to any event. They maybe don't know each other before they get there, but they come from the same online spheres. And I think that's where we see a lot of this activity. With the militia violent extremists, we will see them talk of revolt. You'll see them bring up civil war. That's been a pretty consistent banner. But I would have to say that the organization around that is pretty light. What is more concerning, I think, is a lot of the younger generation, particularly known as accelerationists. Their whole goal, the idea of acceleration, is to bring out or stoke a race-based or a class-based civil war and to provoke that conflict. And I think that's where the real danger comes in, is the greater the frequency you see civil war being discussed, the larger the audience you see gravitate towards that kind of rhetoric. That means going from the extreme to the mainstream. That goes from ideological extremist leaders to politicians saying those sorts of things. Then you're going to have a higher chance of what we would call stochastic terrorism, where the target is known, the perpetrator is not. And it's very difficult to defend against. I think that's the stage that we're really in right now, is it's hard to anticipate where those will come from, but it will come from somewhere.
Clint, you said a bunch of things there that I want to know more about. One, which is, why are you seeing that age divide? Why is it the youngest members of this group who seem sort of the most committed to radical acts? So let's start there.
Yeah, it's a couple components. And what's consistent about it is isolation of young men in the online environment. We see this through a variety of the mass shooter attacks and attempted attacks we've seen over the last 3 to 4 years. There's been a strong uptick in it. At different times, it's usually based around political rhetoric. And I have to say, in election years, that's when the boiling point kind of comes up, because you hear that rhetoric pick up. Separately, with the militia groups, when they do show up, they often go right up to the line of what is protected free speech and assembly, or use of weapons, meaning that they don or show weapons, but they don't really engage in what you might think of as a civil war. So as strange as it seems, while they're more visible and on your face, they actually don't really go over that line as much as the lone shooters that we've seen show up in many mass casualty situations.
The other thing you said that I want to tease out is that these are not just civilians. You have politicians who are using this language. You have people like former Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn saying last week at a Republican fundraiser in Arizona this. Take a listen.
States' rights. Did you know that a governor can declare war? Governor can declare war. Okay? And we're going to probably see that.
So Clint, I want you to do two things there. You can fact check the governor, and then you can talk to me about just how dangerous that rhetoric is coming from someone who has his type of platform.
Yeah, it's just particularly disappointing for me. I knew who General Flynn, he was Colonel Flynn back then in the Army, and to hear that sort of talk is just very upsetting. I think separately, governors don't have the right to declare war. And this entire notion that each state would go to war with each other, it's just nonsensical. I think the danger in that is General Flynn knows that's nonsensical. I actually don't think he probably believes in a lot of it, but that rhetoric is believed. It is believed in the online environment. Groups like QAnon, I think that's the other thing is a year ago, I would have thought QAnon is mostly dead, but part of the embrace of some of these politicians, President Trump being one, General Flynn being another figure, has really started to embrace QAnon again. And this is where you're seeing that dust up. Again, you're seeing talk of civil war in QAnon type circles, and it brings this sort of fever pitch back around. The problem is in those circles, as we saw on January 6th, when things don't unfold and they believe the lie, violence unfolds. I think that's the real tragedy in all of this, is it does mobilize people to violence, and it may only be a few people. In the case of January 6th, it was many. But think if you're at a state capitol coming into the midterms, I think that's where I'm most concerned. State, local governments, polling places, and state capitals headed into November. That's the real vulnerable part. They don't have a force to call to respond to something like we saw on January 6th in the U.S. Capitol.
So just to connect the dots here, how much of all this violent talk can be blamed on Donald Trump?
I think to a large degree it can, but do remember that he has been removed from a lot of the social media platforms. He's been pushed to the fringe platforms, essentially. And I think at this point, it's that the embrace of Trump's rhetoric by many politicians and key figures with outsized voices is really taken over. 2 years ago, you could have said it was about one, and it is about that one individual persistently over time. But there are many, and I mean many candidates running for election from anything from local office all the way up to state positions that are saying the same thing, that are advocating the same thing, literally pursuing power in a political system that they seem to want to overthrow. I think that's where the real danger is at this point, is it has become more diffuse. And if those people are elected into positions, particularly in state governments where they can control the vote or control like a National Guard group, I think we got big problems heading into 2022, 2023, and particularly in 2024.
Clint, I think our audience understands this problem pretty well. I think the big question is where we go from here.
Yeah, it really takes, I think, the movement losing. To be honest, it takes losing at the ballots. And I think that you're seeing a lot of that trend, both in terms of Republican primaries and in terms of general elections. You're seeing a lot of those very fringe candidates that are advocating for violence are not winning broad-based support. They're starting to struggle. Separately, I do think the momentum has come out of a lot of this movement, and that the idea of a civil war or after January 6th, there's a reality horizon that has struck. The problem is there's always the ones that cling to the very, very end of a movement. And when their movement is being pushed away, that oftentimes is when they get backed into a corner and they become more violent. So even when you have success, really pushing back this disinformation, pushing back the idea of these falsehoods which are mobilizing violence, those that stay committed to the very end are also the ones that are willing to fight and die for that movement, even if it's on false pretenses. So I think that's where it gets worrisome, particularly for law enforcement, as they try and really suppress this sort of violence mobilization in the coming weeks and months.